So we are going to create our first Lambda function today as part of our serverless journey. So to do that, just search for Lambda, and once you have Lambda, depending on the time you are looking at this, if this is your first time, just simply click on create function, and then I'm going to give my function a name. I'm going to call my hello world fn, and then the runtime, which is pretty much the programming language in which your code is going to be in, I'm going to select Python, and then under the additional settings, I'm going to create a row purposely for this Lambda function, and then we are going to make use of it. So I'll click on this, and then I'll simply click on create a new row. So this Lambda for now will have these basic permissions and then nothing else. So I'm just going to leave it as it is, and then click on create row. So this is the new row the Lambda created, and it has assigned it to my Lambda function. Click on save. I'll create my function. There are certain key things you need to understand now that you've created your Lambda function. So I'll quickly go to the configuration tab, and on the configuration tab, the key ones you need to understand is your timeout, right? So Lambda function by default can run for a maximum of 15 minutes, and then a timeout pretty much tells you the time it takes for this particular Lambda code or this serverless function to execute. Currently it's set to 3 seconds. So what this means is that the Lambda will only run for 3 seconds, and then if after 3 seconds your Lambda is still processing, what will happen is that the Lambda is going to time out. So Lambda functions, you are built pretty much by the number of minutes it takes to execute, right? So always when you are writing your Lambda function, ensure it's run and then has the right or appropriate time range. So I'm going to click on save, and then the permission we just created is in here. By default, it assigns us the Amazon CloudWatch Log group to it. If we had other or extra permissions, why I showed you that way was that so that you see that you could select those permissions and then add them to it. So if I expand this, you see the permission policy itself and all that. Now let's quickly come back to our actual Lambda code itself. So in a Lambda function, there are key things you need to understand. One is something we reference as your Lambda handler, right? And inside your Lambda handler, there are some key things you have to always pay key attention to. There is the events coming in, right? So the event is pretty much what the input payload contains, or what is in the input payload. So when someone is trying to access your function, or when you are trying to hit your Lambda function, you are sending in an event, right? That payload that comes in is captured in this dictionary called the event. And then you have the context that pretty much tells us about the time, the memory limits, and a couple of details that a Lambda function needs to work with. The handler is pretty much the main guy in here. That is the first function or method that is invoked anytime your code is called. So I'm just going to quickly update this, and then I have a very simple Lambda function code. All that I'm saying is that I'm calling my Lambda handler, and then inside my Lambda handler, I'm getting an event, and inside an event, there is a property called name. So I'm just getting this name, and then I'm returning a hello plus the name. This is all that I'm doing as part of my Lambda function, and I'm importing JSON so that JSON will help me with the structure. If there is something that you want to, there is a package that you want to attach to your code that you don't have, as you work with serverless functions or Lambda functions, you realize that there is something you reference as Lambda layers. And what these Lambda layers does is that it gives you the room to attach these permissions to these Lambda functions. So that's something slightly advanced, but I want you to know that if you worked on a Lambda code and then you are facing, say, a certain package doesn't exist in the Lambda runtime itself by default, you can add them as Lambda layers. So this is all that my code is doing. Once you have your code, the next thing you do is to deploy your code. So I'm going to click on deploy. And then after that, I'm going to simply test it. So I'm just going to click on test, and I'm going to create a test event. So I'm going to call this one say test. And then inside the test, I'm going to send the event. So you see, remember, as I said, each time you invoke your Lambda function, you are sending an event. So if this Lambda was tied to a bigger application, that application will bring in the event. But because I want to test the Lambda function itself, myself. I'm just going to create my own simple events, which you have this probably in the Git repo or something. So what I'm having here is just a simple JSON which states the name, and then the name is in here. So what I'm going to do is to come here, save my event, my test event, and I'll click on invoke. So as you can see, now this is the response. Hello, serverless engineer, right? So this is how basically you can create your Lambda functions. Now, the permission we added initially did something. As I mentioned earlier, added as permissions to CloudWatch. So what this is going to do is that Lambda is going to create a log group. So if you have a bigger Lambda code, which is doing a lot of things, you can at least monitor the logs and see the execution times in CloudWatch log. So I just come to monitor, click on view CloudWatch, and we will see that in here. So you see, this is the Lambda invocation that I just did. And if I come in here, you see the time the Lambda started, right? And then the time it ended, and the seconds and everything that it did to do it. So this is how you can access your CloudWatch log too. So this is pretty much how you create your first Lambda function as part of your serverless engineering journey. Thank you.